Hi, I'm the boring narrator, and I must tell you that today's episode is a real downer. However, it's important for you to know about, and so we should talk about it. Today's episode involves the Native Americans who were living in the southeast of the United States. Some of these tribes were the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee Creek, Seminole, and Cherokee tribes, although there were others. The settlers to the United States had many ideas about what to do about Native Americans. However, for much of the early 19th century, the tribes in the southeast of the United States were treated pretty well. As a matter of fact, they were considered their own nations in some ways. They lived relatively peacefully among their neighbors. However, their neighbors, many of them, wanted the land the Native Americans lived on. They wanted to take that land and farm on it, or look for gold on it, or lots of other things. One person who didn't think much of the Native Americans was Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, in his speech in 1829, that was the State of the Union, called for the removal of these tribes. He wanted them to leave and to move somewhere west of the Mississippi River so that the settlers and the colonists and the inhabitants of these southern states would be able to have their land and use the resources on it. Many people were not fans of this. Some of them were our old friends John Q. Adams and Henry Clay. However, Andrew Jackson managed to convince Congress to pass something called the Indian Removal Act in 1830. It just barely passed Congress, but it did, and Andrew Jackson signed it. What it did was let the federal government make deals with the Native Americans so that they would leave their lands and go someplace that the government had set up for them west of the Mississippi River in what is now Oklahoma. However, it wasn't as if they really had a whole lot of choice. There was a decision that came before the Supreme Court involving whether or not the states would be allowed to just say that the Native Americans weren't allowed to live there anymore. Although the Native Americans more or less won their case, Andrew Jackson wouldn't enforce it. Instead, they started twisting the arms, literally and metaphorically, of the Native Americans to convince them to move. When they didn't want to move, the federal government pulled many dirty tricks. One of them involved the Cherokee tribe in particular. The Cherokee tribe did not want to leave their lands. However, a few members of the Cherokee tribe made a deal with the federal government, even though it was not the leadership of the tribe, nor did the majority of the tribe agree with it. However, the federal government, at this point led by Andrew Jackson's successor, the guy with the weird hair, Martin Van Buren, took this opportunity to say that the Cherokee had to leave, and they marched them by force in the middle of a terrible winter all the way from the eastern states to Oklahoma along something that came to be known as the Trail of Tears. It was every bit as terrible as it sounds, and thousands of the Cherokee died along the way. This is a real low point in the history of the United States. This is a thing that we should not have done, and nobody now agrees that it was a good idea. However, at the time, it was what we did. It was kind of terrible. As a matter of fact, not all of the Native Americans were willing to go. and some of them were willing to fight back, including the Seminole tribe, you may remember them from here, who lived in Florida. The United States insisted that they do it, and for 6 years fought a war against the Seminoles in Florida. Several thousand people died, and 4,000 of the Seminoles were forcibly transported, moved against their will, to the Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. A few of them did remain in Florida, but the situation was really terrible. I apologize for being such a downer, but the Trail of Tears, which happened in 1838, by the way, is something you should know about, as well as the Indian Removal Act and what Andrew Jackson did with it, as well as Martin Van Buren. Hopefully next time we'll have something a little less depressing to talk about.